Good evening, everyone. I'm Colin Bailey, the director of the Morgan Library Museum. I welcome you to the 5th annual Thor lecture, sponsored by the Morgan's Drawing Institute. As you all know, this institute, the Drawings Institute, was founded by the late Jean Thor. Jean provided an endowment to create a center dedicated to the continuing study of drawing. It's administered, the center is administered by the staff of our Department of Drawings and Prints, and the Institute organizes programs ranging from graduate seminars to public lectures. It hosts pre-doctoral, postdoctoral fellows every year, Old Master, 19th century, modern, and contemporary. And we also invite a senior scholar to spend 3 months with us every spring. The Thor Senior Fellows Residency culminates in the annual lecture tonight, and we support also the publication of these lectures. I'm pleased to announce that last year's lecture, The Zoomorphic Mask, delivered by Sir Nicholas Penny, has now been published and is available in our bookstore. Our speaker tonight is Karel von Toyle, and his full name is Karel von Toyle von Siereskirchen. Try that. He is one of the world's leading experts on Italian Renaissance and Baroque drawings. He was a long-term curator at the Tyler Museum in Haarlem, and he became chief curator there in 1989. In 2000, he published the catalogue of the Italian Renaissance drawings at the Tyler's Museum. In 2004, he was Edmund J. Safra Professor at the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts, CASVA, at the National Gallery in Washington. And later that year, he became Directeur du Département des Arts Graphiques, Director of the Department of Graphic Arts at the Louvre, the first non-Frenchman to hold such a position, and he has survived. Carol had a splendid career at the Louvre, did wonderful exhibitions, oversaw the acquisition of marvelous drawings, and really energized the department. He retired from the Louvre in 2013, but he remains active as a scholar. His catalogue of the Italian Baroque drawings at the Tyler Museum is soon to be published. He has been a wonderful presence at the Morgan this spring. He has led graduate seminar, a masterclass. He has examined almost every Italian Baroque drawing in the collection. He's made himself available to our staff, to our collectors, to visitors, and is a generally amiable, supportive, enthusiastic colleague. He'd initially planned to talk more generally about late drawings by Annibale and Agostino Carracci in our collection. That was to have been his topic, but discoveries that he has made within our walls recently have encouraged him to give a slightly more focused examination. At the end of Carol's lecture, we will not hold questions, but I encourage you, after this lecture, if you have something you would like to say to him, it can be easily done at the outside in the lobby, giving the man a moment to take a breath. So, with pleasure, we're welcome to the podium Karel von Toyle with a lecture on Annibale Carracci at the Morgan, Drawings from the Artist's Final Period. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Colin, for these kind words of introduction. It's an honor indeed, and a great pleasure to be here as the Thor Senior Fellow at the Drawings Institute, to work for a while at the Morgan, to get to know this splendid institution from the inside, to become better acquainted with its magnificent collections and members of its staff is a privilege for which I'm truly grateful. Here it is. On the 2nd day of June 1601, a Roman news report, a so-called avviso, announced to the world that the frescoes that Annibale Carracci had painted on a ceiling in the Farnese Palace had been unveiled a few days earlier, to great acclaim. The report went on to say that an altarpiece by the same Carracci was about to be installed in a prominent Roman church in a chapel for which another artist, known as Caravaggio, was painting lateral canvases. In short, the Avviso concluded, one could see that in Rome, the art of painting flourished as rarely before. The unveiling of the Farnese ceiling in the spring of 1601 signified the arrival of Annibale Carracci on the Roman scene. For the artist, it initiated a period of intense activity, a period during which he received numerous commissions from prominent patrons, assembled a group of talented young artists to help him execute those commissions, and rose to the very top of his profession. Yet, less than 4 years later, in the first weeks of 1605, all that came to an abrupt end. Annibale succumbed to a physical and mental breakdown that made it all but impossible for him ever to paint again. What happened? What effect did this illness have on his artistic production, particularly his drawings? How are we to understand drawings produced in the context of his workshop following his initial breakdown? These are questions I would like to address tonight, helped by the fact that the Morgan Library and Museum turns out to own key works that may help us better to understand these issues. Born in Bologna in 1560, Annibale Carracci was 41 years old when the gallery ceiling was unveiled, a mature artist, in full control of his talent and his craft, but not in control of his own time. As a young man, he'd made a brilliant career for himself in his hometown, but here in Rome, where he had been called in 1595 by Cardinal Odoardo Farnese, Carracci remained largely unknown. The Cardinal employed him on a variety of projects, with often dazzling results, but few got to see them, for most of Annibale's work stayed within the walls of the Farnese Palace and was accessible to only a few select guests. Annibale served one of the most powerful men in Rome and lived in the city's grandest palace, but his place in the household was little above that of a common craftsman. He received a monthly stipend for himself, an assistant and a servant, and was lodged in servants' quarters in the attic. And this may actually have suited him quite well. Annibale, the son of a tailor, had few social pretensions. A self-portrait shows us how Annibale saw himself at the age of 33, 2 years before coming to Rome. It's a tiny canvas, just over 20 centimeters high. Wearing a simple mantle slung over his shoulder and a felt hat like any artisan or tradesman, the painter gazes at himself and at us. There's nothing grandiose in the painting, not a wisp of rhetoric, no affirmation of the sitter's pictorial talents, other than in the profundity of his introspection and in his mastery over color and light. Annibale was, in fact, anything but a worldly artist. His biographers paint a portrait of a shy, retiring man, simply, if not slovenly dressed, a man of few words. His chosen form of self-expression was through his art. And when the cardinal or some other grandee came calling to see how work was progressing, he preferred to escape out the back door of his studio. In the eyes of the Farnese court, such behavior undoubtedly marked him as a boorish and uncouth fellow. At a time when other successful artists were received into knightly orders, the Cavaliere d'Arpino, the Cavaliere Roncalli, and so forth, and when yet others, like Caravaggio, perfected La Vie de Bohème, Annibale quietly, industriously worked away, first on the ceiling of the cardinal's bedroom, then in the gallery, in between executing paintings for Farnese chapels and villas, designing embroidery for liturgical vestments, designing silver objects, and probably many more things of which all trace is lost. A contemporary source testifies that Annibale worked like a horse. The unveiling of the ceiling in 1601 marked a big change, however. It made Annibale's name in Rome and established his reputation forever. The ceiling, as we all know, is what we nowadays call an iconic work that changed the course of Western art. Colorful scenes of the loves of the gods, framed by flesh and blood youth and putti, set before stone and stucco terms, bronze roundels, surrounded by grimacing masks, swags of opulent fruit, all of it fictive, created by the painter's brush. Annibale pulled out all the stops in a virtuoso display of pictorial skill, creating a duplicate world of dazzling naturalism in which stone figures seem as alive, as sentient as the naked children gambling around them. The sensuousness of the ceiling, quite inappropriate in a cardinal's residence, but Odoardo Farnese was a young man still, and the sheer inventiveness of its organization opened up the way for the great Baroque ceiling decorations of the 17th century. Behind its complex structure and its stunning evocation of an ideal but living and breathing race of gods and godlike men lay, of course, an endless number of drawings, for drawing was at the heart of Annibale's creativity. The Assumption of the Virgin that Annibale painted for Monsignor Cerasi's chapel in Santa Maria del Popolo, the painting that was referred to also in the news report I quoted earlier, reveals a very different aspect of his art. We know little about Tiberio Cerasi, who was a papal treasurer, but he had a good nose for contemporary art, for he managed to obtain works for his chapel from the two greatest living painters in Rome, Carracci and Caravaggio. If nowadays there's little doubt which of the two is the more famous, in their lifetimes, Caravaggio and Annibale were evenly matched, with a slight edge, perhaps, for Annibale, for unlike Caravaggio, he was known to be a universal artist, capable of doing frescoes as well as oil paintings, tackling serious historical and religious narratives, as well as portraits, genre pieces, and landscapes, a printmaker too, and an incomparable draftsman. Whereas his rival, after some early experiments, basically limited himself to mid-sized canvases with religious themes. And we all know that Caravaggio had no time for drawing. But for all their differences, these two towering geniuses of the early 17th century Rome shared some common goals. Chief among them, the urgent wish to convince the viewer that what they represented on canvas was in some deep way true. The ponderous, monumental figures of this Cerasi Assumption communicate a sense of overpowering presence and gravity. Annibale brings us as close as he can to the miraculous event by making the foremost disciples seemingly protrude into our space. They can see and all but touch the ascending Virgin. We can almost touch them. Annibale's growing reputation motivated a number of young Bolognese painters to leave their hometown in 1601, 1602, and travel to Rome, where they joined the master studio and where they jointly assisted him in the numerous commissions that came his way in these years of success. By all accounts, he was a sympathetic, an excellent teacher, and most of the young men who joined him at this time rose to fame themselves, particularly Francesco Albani, Domenichino, and Giovanni Lanfranco. They worked on the walls of the Farnese Gallery, on frescoes and frescoes and canvases for a garden retreat that Cardinal Odoardo had created for himself behind the palace, and on various other projects, absorbing Annibale's lessons, learning from his example, and imitating his style. Around this time, he received what was to be his biggest commission beyond the Farnese palace walls, when a wealthy Spanish-born banker, Juan de Herrera, charged him with the decoration a fresco of a newly constructed chapel in the Spanish National Church. A prominent location on the Piazza Navona, a large number of narrative frescoes, plus an altarpiece, and all that for an excellent honorarium. When successfully completed, this project will surely confirm Annibale's place at the pinnacle of Roman contemporary art. And then disaster struck. Less than 4 years after his first great Roman success, years in which he had worked incredibly hard and created some outstanding masterpieces, Annibale suffered a severe physical and mental breakdown, brought on perhaps by physical exhaustion, a breakdown from which he never completely recovered. The exact nature of his illness is uncertain. Cardinal Farnese spoke of an attack of goccia, usually taken to mean a seizure or stroke, while the papal surgeon Giulio Mancini, a great admirer of Annibale's art, wrote that the artist was, I quote, overtaken by extreme melancholy, accompanied by a loss of his senses and of memory, such that he neither spoke nor recalled anything with mortal danger. Though the painter recovered to some extent, the attack left him prey to long periods of poor health and profound depression, exacerbated by the lack of appreciation shown him by his patron, who paid him a mere 500 scudi, it is said, for his labors in the Farnese gallery. Wounded by this slight to his honor, Annibale left the cardinal's service in 1605 and found lodgings elsewhere. The moving self-portrait in the Getty Museum may well date from around this time. It shows the artist hollow-eyed, with tousled hair, half crouching, half emerging from an oval cartouche that is decorated with curling dolphins' tails below and with bizarre skeletal dragon-like forms above. Regardless how one interprets this sheet, as a parody or as an intimate document humain, and both views have been defended, there is little doubt, it seems to me, that it depicts a man whose sense of self-worth is, shall we say, conflicted. Illness and depression compelled the painter to relinquish most of his outstanding commissions to his pupils. Annibale lived for another 5 years, dying in July 1609 at the age of 49, but his role on the Roman stage had effectively come to an end in early 1605. No painting exclusively executed by his hand left the studio after that. The only works after 1605 that are incontrovertibly his and his alone are 2 etchings, both dated 1606. They are of religious scenes, the one dramatic, the other peaceful. Both show strong compositions with compact, interlocking forms that produce a monumental effect in spite of their small scale. And they demonstrate that on good days, Annibale had lost none of his power, and that when his health permitted, he was capable of creating profoundly remarkable works. By good fortune, the preparatory drawings for both etchings survive. That, for the Scodella, manifests a strongly pictorial approach to drawing. The image, initially sketched with a pen, has been extensively worked up with a brush in grey and brown washes, as well as white body color. Changes of mind are evident, particularly in the heads of the Virgin and Saint Elizabeth, and the latter's proper left hand was sketched in at least 3 different positions. The equally elaborate drawing for the crowning with thorns, preserved at Chatsworth, is closer to its final image and may be the definitive modello, but there again, Annibale was still thinking creatively about the composition, and he had not yet made up his mind about where to place the reed stick, for instance, in Christ's hand or in those of his tormentor. These 2 drawings remind us that though he may have painted very little, if anything, after his breakdown, Annibale remained perfectly capable of drawing, if he so wished. And indeed, scholars have identified a small group of pen sketches as dating from the years following on the first health crisis. A key example is this rapid sketch of Danae, an impulsive drawing done in preparation of a painting of about 1605-06, a painting unfortunately destroyed during the London Blitz. With a few lines, Annibale delimited the space for his composition, indicated in figures and the setting, without wasting any time or effort to make it a pretty drawing. Stylistically, the sketch builds upon his pen drawings from the years immediately preceding, best exemplified perhaps in the sketches that he made to help his pupils who were finishing the walls of the Farnese gallery. For example, this little drawing of Mercury and Apollo, done in preparation of a small fresco in the gallery. Annibale set the scene, established the action such as it is, and determined the poses of the figures, but disregarded anatomical niceties, knowing that when his pupil came to paint the fresco, he would make sure that Apollo's leg and foot were correctly proportioned. Even more cursory is this sketch for a seated Virtue, for another decorative panel in the on the gallery's walls. It provides just enough information to establish pose and the drapery pattern, but leaves the rest to the assistant's best abilities. From sketches such as these, an evolution to the equally abbreviated but harsher and more incisive manner of the Danae is plausible and indeed perhaps understandable after a life-threatening illness. Critics have called the post-breakdown period that of Annibale's ugly style. He no longer spent any time on anything he considered superfluous to the forms and ideas he wanted to set down. No refinements of grace, no elegant calligraphic lines. Like the late etchings, these drawings disregard aesthetic proprieties in an urgent form of shorthand. An example is this fine drawing recently acquired by the Princeton University Art Museum of two women and a seated man. The artist doesn't even attempt to make any real connection visible between the body of the woman on the left and the bits of drapery that flutter behind her back and her leg. He seems to have been thinking it needs a bit more mass there, quickly adding a few pen strokes that suggest that evoke billowing drapery, and left it at that. Not much more elaborate is this design in Düsseldorf that connects with the Scodella etching of 1606. Again, details are not worked out, and in the act of drawing the child's head, Annibale changed his mind and altered its position into a stricter profile view with a few harsh lines that one might say disfigure the drawing. An ugly style indeed, but ugliness is in the eye of the beholder, and an expressive charge of these sketches is not in doubt. For instance, this small sketch at Oberlin for a penitent Magdalene with an angel of the same late years. Messy, unresolved, but highly expressive for all that. The best-known drawing by Annibale in the Morgan Library belongs to this period, but one would hesitate to call it ugly. I refer to this wonderfully energetic study for an Adoration of the Shepherds. Acquired as a gift from a New York collector in 1978, the sheet is celebrated as one of the finest testimonies to the fact that, despite his illness and depression, Annibale was still creating masterly works on paper towards the end of his life. The sketch is drawn on the verso of a trial proof of one of his late etchings, The Crowning with Thorns. And there are smudges of black printer's ink beneath the pen lines of the Adoration. It therefore must date from 1606 at the earliest, but may well be even later. It's very much a first sketch in which Annibale worked out some ideas. The placing of the four angels' heads that gaze in adoration at the child in his mother's lap, the precise pose of the infant shepherds who seem to dance with joy as they approach the holy figures, and the position of the piper's head. A brown smudge covers an initial idea, obliterated with a swipe of the brush or perhaps the artist's finger. Authorship, subject, and date of this sketch are entirely unproblematic. There is less certainty as to its purpose. The Adoration of the Shepherds is a theme that Annibale took up repeatedly in his Roman years, in paintings, drawings, and a print. Its appeal may have lain in the wide cast of characters it offers, including angels and animals, and a broad range of expression, from amazement to joy to maternal pride, or perhaps because it was a nocturnal scene, calling for virtuoso light effects. In all his different versions, Annibale always paid homage to the great altarpiece called La Notte that Correggio had painted a century earlier, almost, for a church in Reggio Emilia, and which he had known all his life. Opinions differ as to which particular adoration the vigorous Morgan sketch relates, a print or a painting. The framing lines limiting the picture field indicate that the artist had a horizontal composition in mind. Such is also the case in a second study relating to the same project, a sheet that entered the Louvre 15 years ago. Whether it precedes or follows on the Morgan drawing is an open question. The shepherd with the bagpipes is much the same, though Annibale considered different leg positions in the Louvre drawing. The child is not on its mother's knees, but in the manger, the Virgin kneeling to one side, and the faces of the adoring angels from the Morgan sheet are only lightly sketched in. The dancing boys have disappeared. Instead, a whole new crowd of shepherds presses around the manger, and Joseph stands behind the angels, his arms full of fodder for the ass and the ox just visible behind the Virgin. To the left, more shepherds arrive with their flock. Evidently, the draftsman ran out of space on the right edge of the sheet and inserted the group, illogically but understandably, to the left. The horizontal format indicated by the framing lines has led to the suggestion that both studies relate to an undated print, an etched and engraved Adoration, in which some of the motifs studied in both Morgan and Louvre drawings recur, most obviously Joseph feeding the animals, and the beam or post around which the shepherds crowd in the Louvre drawing, and which comes to bisect the scene in the print. The prominent piper is absent, though, and the numerous shepherds from the Louvre sheet have been reduced to just 4. A drawing at Windsor is the final design for the print, stylistically not all that far removed from the Morgan and Louvre drawings, but it is not at all evident how the boisterous adoration evoked in those studies could have led to this quieter image of contemplation and silent adoration. A more fitting candidate has been thought to be a painting with which our drawing definitely seems, to which it definitely seems related, but which introduces a new set of questions and problems. It is this large Adoration of the Shepherds on canvas in the National Gallery of Scotland. Here we find the piper, the angels behind the manger, Joseph with hay for the animals, all of the motifs we noted before. But the Edinburgh picture is an upright format, while the Morgan study is clearly intended for a horizontal composition. And what is more, the Edinburgh painting is perhaps not by Annibale at all, but by his pupil Domenichino instead. It's a very complicated story, and forgive me if I don't go into it now. The main problem is one of chronology. Preliminary drawings, certainly made for the Edinburgh composition, established that it was conceived around 1600. That is, well before Annibale drew the Morgan Adoration on the back of an etching of 1606. But if the Morgan drawing and its counterpart in Paris were not made in preparation for the etching nor for the Edinburgh composition, what then can we suggest as to its purpose? Given the late date, 1606 at the earliest, we might consider the Morgan and Louvre drawings in the light of a rather moving document from the end of Annibale's life, a document found on the back of a studio drawing in Turin. It's a contract of sorts, drawn up between Annibale and the 3 pupils who shared their master's lodgings near what is now the Quattro Fontane in Rome. In translation, the text reads, "Firstly, that every one of us shall be obliged to make a small painting, a quadro da testa, every 5 weeks, on canvas, and I'll put them on stretchers for all of us, and that it will be deemed finished, and that they will be finished in blank time, and they undertake to stay at work 2 hours each day, starting from 14th July 1608. End of text. The first to sign was Giovanni Antonio Solari, if I can sign here. Then a Carracci pupil from Milan, about whom we know virtually nothing else but his signature here. Then Annibale's nephew, Antonio, signed the document also, as did Annibale himself. Io Annibale affermo quanto di sopra. And finally, Sisto Badalocchio from Parma. This rather pathetic document has been interpreted, correctly I'm sure, as an attempt by his pupils to keep Annibale actively involved in painting. It was undoubtedly an act of sympathy and support on their part, but at the same time not entirely devoid of self-interest. Pupils and assistants relied on their master to provide them with work, either on his own projects or by having them copy his inventions or by obtaining outside work. Annibale's long indisposition had mostly prevented him from fulfilling that role for his youngest pupils, and their careers suffered accordingly. Whether the contract of 1608 had any positive results is not known. The fact is that there are any number of small Annibalesque paintings that derive from the master's ideas and compositions, paintings executed by pupils that testify to a flourishing studio activity producing variants. Among them are several adorations of the shepherds, including well-known works by Lanfranco and Badalocchio that may date from around 1609. Many of the elements from the Morgan drawing recur with variations in these small works, presumably made for the open market. Another variant is given in a panel that came up at a New York auction some years ago. Its anonymous author has made use of various elements encountered in the Morgan Adoration and its Louvre counterpart, though each has undergone modifications. The young shepherds arriving from the left, the Virgin kneeling behind the manger, tenderly embracing her child, the bagpipe player, now seated instead of framing the scene at left, and Joseph, occupied with the two animals. The shepherd, advancing on the right, his long crook against his shoulder, reminds us of the kneeling man in the Paris drawing. Could it be that Annibale's late pen adorations originated not as projects for his own works, but as suggestions sketched to aid his pupils in their pictorial exercises? The way in which motifs and ideas from earlier adorations are recycled and combined in these drawings suggests that they stand at the end of a long and fertile series of inventions. There's another drawing at the Morgan I would like to discuss in the context of Annibale's so-called ugly style. It's a pen drawing of a different sort than those we've been examining so far. It belongs among his quick pen sketches taken from life, a type of drawing which Annibale must often have made, but of which relatively few examples survive. His biographer, Malvasia, tells how Annibale and the other members of the Carracci family and academy made a habit of sketching scenes and people encountered in the streets of Bologna or on their walks in the countryside. The Royal Collection has a number of examples from Annibale's Roman years, including the man before a landscape and the man carrying a bell. The most famous and most elaborate is this image of an execution. The economy of means and the apparent detachment with which Annibale recorded this harrowing scene are striking and entirely characteristic of the artist. Slightly later in date, perhaps about 1605, is the woman in a contemporary dress, described by Rudolf Wittgauer in his exemplary 1952 catalogue of the Windsor drawings as a Roman lady of a type familiar in the circle and school of the Carracci. Her head is veiled. She wears a long cloak over her dress, and on her feet are pattens, which allow her to navigate the puddles and the dirt of Roman alleys without danger. Related is another sheet in Wittgauer's catalogue, Studies of Women Walking, a small drawing barely 16 centimeters high. Wittgauer associated with figures in Annibale's late paintings, including the famous Aldobrandini lunettes. A similarly dressed woman is seen purposefully crossing the street, her long veil or cloak gathered up to prevent it from trailing in the dirt. The dry, scratchy manner of drawing is that of Annibale's last years. Now it seems to me that this sheet in the Morgan Library, though appreciably larger, belongs to the same family. It was acquired by Janos Scholz in 1956 as the work of the early Renaissance printmaker Giovanni Antonio da Brescia, but Scholz himself attributed to the 15th century Venetian painter Gentile Bellini, mainly, it seems, on the basis of the architectural sketches on the verso, a view of a square with numerous tiny figures before a colonnaded portico, a floor plan of a church, and some sketches of what might be a church interior. Other scholars have preferred to associate this sheet with Gentile's brother Giovanni Bellini or his circle. And most recently, it was exhibited as a work of the Venetian school around 1500. I suspect the drawing dates about a century later, around 1606, has little to do with Venice and all the more with Annibale in Rome. We see perhaps the same young woman that he depicted in the smaller Windsor sheet, but now in the opposite direction. She has gathered her long veil at her hips, exactly as her counterpart at Windsor, and she's also wearing pattens. She's shown 3 times, in true profile on the left, turning her head to face us on the right, and in between, very faintly seen on the back. The Morgan drawing is not in very good condition. The ink has sunk. But the handling, the way in which the draftsman delineated and distinguished the folds of the heavy cloak from the thinner skirt below it, strikes me as identical. As is the summary, but absolutely typical treatment of the woman's face. Compare, for instance, this drawing by Annibale in the Louvre, a design for Christ handing the keys to St. Peter of about 1605. One may also compare the woman's face to those of the Virgin and St. Elizabeth in the drawing we saw earlier for the 1606 etching. In some of these cases, Annibale may have used a reed pen, which creates a thicker, more incisive line than the supple quill. The reed's broad nib doesn't allow for much subtlety, however, and the figure's eyes, for instance, become just dark triangles in the profile view. For all that, there's no less loss of expressiveness. One feels the woman's gaze, in the intent gaze in the Scholz drawing. To my mind, there's no doubt that this is a drawing by Annibale of about 1606, somewhat compromised perhaps by long exposure to light, but perfectly genuine and of great interest. Whitcar's association of the Windsor drawing with the Aldobrandini lunettes comes to mind when we look at the verso of the Morgan sheet. Might these perspectival sketches, difficult to decipher as they are, have anything to do with the monumental portico in the Visitation? It's hard to be certain, but at the very least, one can say that the little stick figures, like ninepins or skittles, that people the square and the steps are entirely typical of Annibale. And there is also, barely distinguishable, perhaps, a profile head of Roman type, which I hope you can make out. Here's the head, the eye, nose, chin, and the neck. Like that. I hope you can make it out in this detail with thanks to Zoe Watnick for her photographic skills. Like the Adoration of the Shepherds, the three views of a standing woman fits easily enough among the small number of generally accepted pen drawings from Annibale's last years. Their style, whether one calls it ugly or not, is understandable as evolving from pre-1605 pen drawings and requires little explanation. But prior to his illness, Annibale had also produced different sorts of drawings, powerful chalk figure studies, washed composition designs. What about them? Did he never again make any of those? The question has rarely been posed. Leaving aside chalk studies, a category absent from the Morgan's Carracci drawings, tonight we shall concentrate on pen and wash compositions. There are excellent examples of pre-1605 pen and wash composition studies by Annibale, from the airy and calligraphic sketch for Pan and Selene on the Farnese ceiling of about 1599, to the more statuesque design of some few years later for a small altarpiece in the Quirinal. The splendid stoning of St. Stephen at Windsor is most likely preparatory to a painting in the Louvre of about 1603. A preliminary sketch in black chalk or lead point, now barely visible, established the figure groups in the background. With a quill, Annibale then framed the image, sketched in the figures' contours and their drapery, before adding shadows and substance with a brush dipped in diluted ink. Afterwards, he took up his pen again to clarify and to improve, adding contours or drapery foils where necessary. Do drawings like these have no offspring after 1605? From the present state of the literature, one might believe that to be the case, even though Whitcar had already qualified this pen and wash drawing with scenes from the Passion as very late, which it certainly is. Its links with the 1606 etching suggest a similar post-breakdown date. It's as expressive in its depiction of suffering and brutality as is the etching, and despite the addition of washes, as cursory as the so-called ugly pen sketches. And what of the freer, more calligraphic type of pen drawings that Annibale also did prior to 1605, exemplified in the loops and swirls that established the figures' poses in Saint Cecilia and Valerian, or the man with a vase? Did the mental breakdown extinguish all desire for such virtuoso displays of swirling pen lines? The answer may lie in a singular album in the Morgan Library Museum that is associated with the last years of Annibale's existence. Known as the Album of the Life of St. Paul, this little studied volume was acquired as a gift of the Fellows in 1964 at Sotheby's in London, where it appeared as an anonymous Italian work of the early 17th century. A label on the spine indicates that the drawings in the album contained were once believed to be by Nicolas Poussin. It was reportedly Sotheby's expert James Byam Shaw who first suggested a link with Annibale Carracci. Walter Witzthum agreed when he referred to it shortly after its acquisition in an article in which he characterized the album as belonging to the late phase of Annibale's studio. Since then, its connection with Annibale and/or his studio has, to my knowledge, not been doubted in any serious way. But the album has been surprisingly little discussed. The Thor Fellowship has provided a unique opportunity to examine the album repeatedly and at length, aided by the staff at the Drawings Institute and the conservators in the Thor Conservation Center. Other than two frontispieces and the title page, it consists of 46 pages of illustrations, each with a page of manuscript text in Italian on the facing page, numbered in Roman numerals. The text is based on the Acts of the Apostles and recounts the life of Saul of Tarsus from his presence at the stoning of the deacon Stephen, his conversion and baptism, to finally his martyrdom in Rome. In the margins, the scribe referred to the biblical source, provided a synopsis, and noted the calendar year in which the event is believed to have occurred. The text is not signed, and there's no indication as to identity of the scribe or the illustrator. Of its purpose, original ownership, date, authorship, we know nothing beyond what may be inferred from the volume itself. Some scholars have suggested a link with the election to the papal throne in 1605 of Camillo Borghese, who took the name Paul V. But a papal destination is surely unlikely in view of the sober, unadorned character of text and images, and the absence of any heraldic reference to the Borghese, the church, or the papacy on the very elaborate frontispieces to the album. These frontispieces are found on either side of the same sheet. They present a finely delineated triumphal arch, carefully rendered in pen and ink, with washes to add a sense of volume. Sturdy Tuscan columns set on tall bases support the entablature. The tympanum sports a projecting oval cartouche, while the body of the arches and the friezes feature small panels of different shapes and sizes, bearing both texts and enigmatic images that, upon examination, prove to be mottos or emblems reflecting on the life and the writings of St. Paul. The reference to the apostle is made obvious by the inscriptions in large capitals curving around the archway. Gentium Doctori on the one side, Veritatis Predicatori on the other. These are epithets of Paul that to this day, though in different order, adorn his statue outside the Roman basilica that bears his name, to the instructor of the people and to the preacher of truth. These arches bring to mind ephemeral arches erected on the occasion of festive entries, but they also look like printed title pages, such as the one that Annibale's brother Agostino Carracci engraved for the 1590 edition of Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, an image Annibale and his pupils would have been familiar with. And closely comparable is this painting, likewise stemming from the Carracci circle, a small painting, a small canvas in the Prado that Domenico Zampieri, better known as Domenichino, made around 1609 for his friend Giovanni Battista Agucchi. Agucchi was a Bologna-born letterato in the service of the Aldobrandini family, but more to the point, he was a good friend and admirer of both Annibale and of his pupil Domenichino. In a recent lecture at the Prado Museum, Elizabeth Cropper has analyzed Domenichino's painting and argued persuasively that it should be seen as a portrait moralisé, a sort of coded portrait of Agouki himself. The various reliefs, imprese and mottos pictured on the arch refer to both John the Baptist and his namesake, Giovanni Battista Agouki. We may assume something similar was intended with frontispieces of the album, but since we do not know for whom it was made, we cannot solve all the riddles that they pose. Many of the mottos derive from the writings of St. Paul, from Cupio dissolvi, I desire to dissolve, from Paul's letter to the Philippians, which accompanies an image of a phoenix eager to be consumed by fire in order to be reborn, or facie ad faciem, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. An eagle faces the sun. Legend had it that eagles, alone among creatures, could look directly at the sun. Most amusing is the image on the column space at right, showing a stag scratching behind its ear. The text it illustrates comes from the second letter to the Corinthians. Most gladly will I glory in my infirmities. Quite how the acrobatic stag explicates that text is not immediately obvious. Leaving aside, though, the many questions that remain about these frontispieces, let us consider the drawings themselves. There are 46 illustrations in all, set within pre-drawn framing lines. The upright format of the frame obviously limited the illustrator's scope. There was no space for broad landscapes or extensive crowd scenes. We do not know whether scribe and illustrator were one and the same, nor do we know who determined which episodes from Paul's life were to be illustrated, but we may imagine some theologian or letterato was consulted. The selection of scenes posed a formidable challenge to the draftsman, for not only does the album highlight incidents in the apostles' story for which no iconographical precedent existed, forcing him to invent ex novo, but in many cases, the narrative is essentially the same. Scenes of baptism, for instance, scenes of Paul and Barnabas preaching, disputing with others. As we shall see, the draftsman rose to this particular challenge. The technique is simple. Pen and brown ink, light washes added in diluted ink over a preliminary sketching what appears to be lead point. In a majority of cases, the ink has over time acquired a warm golden brown hue. There is some variation. Sometimes the ink has a greenish tinge, and midway through the album we encounter a small number of drawings with grey instead of brown washes. In 46 illustrations, some are inevitably better designed or better executed than others. The first few drawings in the album are easily the least successful, the most wooden in terms of composition as well as treatment. It opens with the stoning of St. Stephen, a subject Annibale in his studio had depicted on numerous occasions in the early 1600s. An art image has elements of these versions, but lacks their vitality. Compared with the studio picture in Genoa, the composition is timid and uninspired. The small figures stay well within the limits of the picture field, barely overlap, and are uncomfortably posed. And the figure of Saul in the foreground is particularly ungainly. Similar lack of nerve seems to lie behind the illustration that follows, the conversion of Saul. Here we have, as it happens, several splendid, fiery pen drawings of the subject by Annibale at Windsor, which use some of the same motifs, but treat them with far greater energy and virtuosity. And again, there's a small painting in Genoa, a studio work, with which our drawing may be compared, not necessarily to its advantage. It has not yet been analyzed precisely how the volume was put together, but as one leaves through its pages, there is a growing suspicion that the drawings were made more or less in the order in which they are bound. For as the story progresses, the draftsman's handling becomes more and more fluent and confident. Here, some images from the first half of the album. The ordination of Paul and Barnabas, St. Paul prohibiting that the citizens of Lista make sacrifice to him, and Paul casting out an evil spirit from a young woman in Philippi. The distance from the first images is appreciable. The figures now occupy the picture field with ease. With few lines, a few licks of transparent wash, the draftsmen establish their poses and their interrelationship. And the confidence with which he uses abbreviations or approximations of shapes to suggest entire figures is often striking, as is the way in which the architecture in the background is used to frame and clarify the narrative, alternatively binding the figures together or setting groups off one from the other. Are these differences in quality to be explained by a difference in hand? That would be the easiest solution, but I do not believe it can be correct. Close examination of the originals strongly suggests that the frontispieces accepted all the drawings in the album by one and the same hand. 2 of them have been tipped in, inserted to replace perhaps damaged or spoiled first versions, or they may have been additions, but these insertions happened very early on, since the text runs across the overlap. Can the occasional differences in treatment and quality then be explained as a wish to experiment, perhaps? Are they the result of the draftsman's mood or the state of his health? We have no answer. What is most striking about the album as a whole is the quality of invention that it displays. No 2 designs are the same. That fertility of imagination is particularly noticeable in the numerous scenes in which the apostle confronts his opponents. Here, several such disputations. Paul in the Apostolic Council, addressing the Areopagus at Athens, disputing with priests in Jerusalem, accused in front of Felix, expounding his beliefs to Felix and Drusilla, and appearing at Caesarea before Herod Agrippa. Each time, the viewpoint, the staging, the background are different, but in each case, the narrative remains crystal clear. 2 more images from the middle section, the blinding of Elymas and the baptism of the prison guard, both highly effective compositions. The blinding has a major pentimento in the central figure, Elymas, who has suddenly been deprived of his sight because he wanted to prevent Paul from speaking. Initially, the man's proper right leg was bent sharply at the knee. That's what here you can just make out maybe, emphasizing his stumbling forward motion. But the artist may have decided against that solution because it would have seemed exaggerated or unbalanced. And the searching, fumbling gesture that Elymas now makes communicates his lack of sight more effectively and affectingly. Such pentimenti, large and small, occur throughout the album, an indication that the artist was free to invent and change as he went along, an important point to remember. Often, the draftsman had to invent illustrations for scenes that had rarely been treated in art before, if at all. In so doing, he arrived at some astonishing solutions. The image on the left shows a very minor episode that occurred after Paul had been taken prisoner in Jerusalem. The military tribune, Claudius Lysias, had him brought to the army barracks. But because rioting crowds pressed on all sides, the soldiers were obliged to lift the apostle, trussed in chains, onto their shoulders in order to get him up the steps to their headquarters. And you can make out here how Paul is carried along. And in a brilliant inspiration, the artist made palpable the lack of space with which the soldiers had to cope by inventing a cliff or abyss at their feet at left. Illogical, but highly effective. In numerous drawings, particularly in the later sections of the album, the urgency of invention and the speed of execution are almost palpable. Case in point, the fall of Simon Magus, here on the right. It provides one of the best demonstrations that the drawings were done alla prima, invented on the page and not following some preliminary sketch. The lead point with which the artist laid out the image has not been completely rubbed away. And we discover a head facing us just to the right of the kneeling apostles. I think I'm indicating it here. In a change of mind, the artist disregarded that head and sketched loosely and fluently some figures standing at a higher level, leaving the ghostly head at the level of their chests. Note the confidence with which he's traced the kneeling apostles, a few looping lines, some hatching and some nicely judged touches of wash, nothing defined, yet everything is successfully conveyed. The economy of means is remarkable. Passages like these prove, it seems to me, that the artist responsible for the album's illustrations was a consummate draftsman with years of practice and experience to fall back on. Two final images from the life of St. Paul bring home the overall quality of the compositions. The healing of the father of the prefect of Malta on folio 38, and on the other side, the miracle of the three fountains. The sobriety, the starkness of the first scene is its chief characteristic. The sick man's bed stands at right angles to the room's back wall, in which a rectangular window provides a glimpse of the sea. Paul stands in profile by his patient's bedside and prays for his recovery, his right hand extended. It's the only motion in an otherwise deadly quiet room, in which all eyes concentrate on Paul's gesture. In a nice touch, the apostle has slipped his other hand under the bedclothes, a laying on of hands as described in the Acts. Notice also the cat beneath the bed. Against this image of quiet concentration, worthy of Poussin, stands the depiction of the miracle that occurred immediately after St. Paul had been beheaded. As the executioner put his sword back in its sheath, unaware of what's happening, the apostle's head bounced 3 times on the ground before coming to rest. And each time the saint's head hit the ground, a spring burst forth on that very spot. By placing the figures along a receding and ascending diagonal, the artist creates space for the 3 successive springs, and the difference in ground level makes it just about believable that the miracle could have occurred in this way. Note with how much ease he now exploits the limits of the picture field to suggest the excited reactions of the faithful. But who was this he, this accomplished illustrator? It's time to address that issue. The critical history of the album is easily summarized. Its attribution has remained essentially unchanged since its acquisition, Annibale, Carracci, and all studio. In his 1971 monograph on Annibale, Donald Posner acknowledged the inventive fertility of the images and did not exclude the possibility that Annibale might have made some of the drawings himself, but he basically supposed them to derive from prior sketches by the master. The executant would have been an unnamed studio member. In later years, the idea that Annibale might have been directly involved has not been taken up. When the album is mentioned at all, it's presented purely as a studio product. A proper evaluation of the drawings is not helped by the fact that the only comparable Annibalesque pen and wash drawings known to belong to the years around 1606, are the equally difficult designs in Stockholm relating to Capella Herrera. This is not the moment to go into the complex history of that commission or the division of hands. Suffice it to say that 7 drawings in the National Museum in Stockholm depict episodes from the life of San Diego de Alcalá that relate to the chapel's frescoes, but their status as preparatory designs is far from obvious. Their quality has been deemed below anything anybody could ever have produced. The group remains little studied, witness the fact that good digital images are as yet unobtainable. A forthcoming exhibition in Madrid will address these questions and surely provide some answers. But for the time being, we can observe that the best of the sheets, a study of a miracle in which Diego saves a young boy from an oven, happens to relate to one of the few frescoes Annibale is believed to have executed himself. Now, the standard explanation for these Swedish drawings is that they were made by members of the studio on the basis of small sketches supplied by Annibale, much as had happened a few years earlier with the walls of the Farnese Gallery, and the same has also been suggested for the album of St. Paul. Posner believed the illustrations based on sketches by the master, even if closer examination belies that idea. Might the drawings of the life of Paul then be independent inventions by one of Annibale's pupils, one particularly well-versed in the master's stylistic idiom? We know the names and can judge the capabilities of all the important pupils in Annibale's studio during the years in question, to wit, Francesco Albani, Domenichino, Tacconi, Giovanni Lanfranco, and Sisto Badalocchio. Albani was Annibale's chief assistant in the Herrera chapel, and this sheet in the Louvre for the chapel's cupola is undoubtedly his. Technically, stylistically, it's perhaps not dissimilar to the Morgan and Stockholm drawings, but what betrays the pupil is the drawing's emotional emptiness, the lack of tension, the lack of expression in faces and gestures and even in the draperies. More interesting, from the point of view of the Morgan album, is comparison with these two sheets given to Albani, one from the beginning of his Roman years, the other 4 or 5 years later. They show him gradually strengthening his manner, adopting a more Roman manner, and abandoning the ballad-like grace in evidence in the stoning of Stephen. Yet neither of these sheets is at all close to anything we find in the Morgan album. And there's a fussiness, a lack of clarity that's the opposite of what we find in the life of St. Paul. I don't believe that the album's attribution to Albani, sometimes proposed with some confidence, can be sustained. Domenichino and Lanfranco are the other two most talented assistants in anybody's workshop. Few pen and wash drawings by either survive from these early years, but those few that we do have do not suggest that either possessed as yet the technical and expressive mastery evident in the life of St. Paul. Badalocchio, Tacconi, and the younger pupils need not even be considered. Their pen and wash drawings never came truly close to those of their teacher. It seems to me that an attribution of the Morgan album to an unnamed collaborator of Annibale Carracci is altogether too facile. We know who collaborated with Annibale in these years, and we know more or less of what they were capable. Not one of them can seriously be considered as the draftsman behind the life of St. Paul. Nor does it seem credible that various hands were involved in its execution, as we saw earlier. Should we therefore conclude that it was, after all, Annibale himself who made these drawings, as I'm sure originally supposed? While Posner left open the possibility that some of the drawings might be by him, he rejected most of them because he felt they, quote, lacked the force and harshness of Annibale's draftsmanship as it is known from his late certain drawings, with which he meant the drawings in the ugly style. Now this is tantamount, it seems to me, to comparing cheese and chalk. For the ugly drawings, few as they are preparatory in character, and not one of them counts as an autonomous drawing, which the Morgan drawings so evidently are. Posner went on to say, not yet enough is known of the range of Annibale's late draftsmanship, and it seems possible that the demands of the project may have led to a modification in his manner. This observation still appears entirely justified. The demands of the project need to be taken into account, as do, I would suggest, the after effects of severe illness and depression. Comparison of the life of St. Paul drawings with pen and wash drawings made by Annibale after 1600 shows that many of the traits we found in the latter recur in the album. The energy of line, the fluid application of wash, the ostensibly careless but remarkably effective delineation, when he wants to, of figures. The sense of their emotional presence, however summarily they are sketched. Rapidly traced lanes establish whole figures as if in a single gesture, the hand barely lifting the pen from the page. Compare this detail from the Saints Cecilia and Valerian of about 1600 with the one from the Fall of Simon Magus in the album that we looked at earlier. Their compatibility will, I hope, be obvious. Much further study needs to be undertaken before we can fully understand the album and its drawings, including their iconographical sources. I just want to draw your attention very briefly to one final aspect of the life of St. Paul that deserves investigation, and that is the album's place within the resurgent interest in the history of the early church in the years around the big Jubilee of 1600. In Rome, many early Christian basilicas were restored, and the catacombs explored, scholars edited old text, antiquarians investigated archaeological remains for information on the beginnings of the church and the lives of the early martyrs. Ancient monuments, like the Domus Aurea, were studied anew, not so much now for their fanciful grotesques, but for what their narrative paintings could tell about ancient Roman civilization. Giovanni Pietro Bellori owned a drawing by Annibale Carracci in which the artist had copied one such wall painting, a scene from the Domus Aurea that was then interpreted as showing the Roman hero Coriolanus confronted by his mother and his wife. Bartoli engraved Carracci's drawings in Bellori's collection in the 1670s, and although the original has disappeared, A copy after it is found at Windsor Castle, here on the left. It surely is not fortuitous that this copy, stilted as it is, displays many of the stylistic elements we observed in the life of St. Paul. Is it possible that Annibale, or the person for whom the album was made, considered this simple, sober style congruent with antiquity and the early saints? The question needs further research. The field of Carracci connoisseurship being what it is perhaps foolhardy to claim at this point that many of the drawings of the life of St. Paul are masterpieces and that they are all by Annibale. But it will have become obvious that I believe that possibility deserves serious consideration. Either these drawings are the work of Annibale Carracci, done during his illness and during periods of recovery, or Francesco Albani, or whichever other pupil, was a far better and more incisive draftsman than we ever knew. Annibale's breakdown, the long years of his ill health, meant that his students lacked the opportunity to learn from their master. It meant that patrons in Rome had to look elsewhere for an artist of comparable stature to execute the altarpieces and frescoes they might wish to commission. Annibale barely painted anything, but he did not stop drawing. Posner was right when he said that not yet enough is known of the range of Annibale's late draftsmanship. And the Life of St. Paul album is a case in point, where we need to reconsider how illness and depression might have affected a consummate draftsman, one for whom drawing was a primary mode of expression. Superlative sketches survive from Annibale's last difficult years. They include the ugly pen drafts, vibrant sketches like that for the Adoration of the Shepherds, and, in my view also, the occasionally awkward but endlessly inventive and entirely fascinating illustrations to the life of St. Paul. They also include some extraordinarily evocative and poetic landscapes, like this view of the Mediterranean coast with the setting sun. Perhaps Annibale drew it in the summer of 1609, going or returning from a short visit to Naples, where he went in hopes of recovery. He died not long after, on 15 July, in Rome, much lamented by his family, by his pupils and his remaining friends. It seems an appropriate image on which to end this talk. Thank you.